Okay, Ryan, I'd like to talk about pyramidal and polarized training and maybe some misconceptions that a lot of cyclists I feel have, just from speaking to people. This is anecdotal. And also possibly the best approach with them, and that's using them in combination, which we'll talk about at the end. But first things first, because it does get confusing for a lot of people out there with this stuff, because there's so many different zone models. When we talk about polarized and pyramidal, we're technically looking at a 3-zone model. And a lot of people are probably used to 5 or 6 zones. At the RCA, we use 7. So I was like, what the hell is going on here? So maybe if we just peel it back before we talk about these, what is the 3-zone model?
So 3-zone model is a scientific based model. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's used practically in a coaching sense at all.
Okay.
So not many people would use it to prescribe training, but amongst the research, it's been 50 years of using the 3-zone model just because it's simple and it's set out based on physiological markers. So if you look at zone 1, the top end of zone 1 is defined by your LT1, lactate threshold 1, or ventilated threshold 1. So it's kind of that first point where you get to, you're like, well, if I go over this, I'm working a little bit harder. I can actually feel you start to lose a bit of conversation and you start getting a bit harder.
But you can probably still talk a little bit.
You could probably still talk a little bit, but you can notice a little bit of difference there of effort. And then you get into zone 2. The top end of zone 2 is your lactate threshold, typical lactate threshold.
Your FTP.
Functional threshold power. Your ventilatory threshold as well is another good marker.
Okay.
And then above that, you're getting into severe domain. So
and it goes up like a hockey stick in terms of your lactate levels.
Maximum effort. So you can use lactate measure 2 and 4 millimolar. LT1, LT2 is generally what you use. It's very variable, but that's generally what people use. So on a typical zone, transferring that to a 6-zone model, for example, zone 1 in a 3-zone model is zone 1 and 2 in a 6-zone model. Zone 3 and half of zone 4 in a 6-zone model.
Or sweet spot.
Or sweet spot.
People call that, or sub-threshold.
Just below threshold. That's zone 2. So zone 2 in the 3-zone model is defined by your FTP, whereas in the other models, that's the middle of zone 4. So it's quite different there in that aspect. And then above that is zone 3. So anything above your threshold is...
So for us at the RCA, that's zones, top end zone 4, 5, 6, and 7 sits in zone 3.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
It's quite confusing and there's a lot going on there. You might need to do an overlay of a bit.
Yeah, we can put some overlay so people can get a visualization. And as you say, like to actually prescribe somebody just to do zone 3, there's a lot that you could do in zone 3 that we can separate. So it doesn't make sense structurally as a coach or in people's training plans, but scientifically based off of a lactate graph, it makes a lot of sense.
Yes. So, and I think I heard someone say the other day that we use, they're our physiological zones, our broad physiological zones, but we use a 6-zone model or a 7-zone model for training prescription so we can be more specific with that physiology. Otherwise it's too broad.
Yeah, okay. So then we've got the 2 different approaches that we can take. We've got polarized and we've got pyramidal. Now, polarized, a lot of people know about through Stephen Seiler, I always say his name wrong. And Inigo now, like there's a lot of zone 2 stuff, which is then translated into people talking about polarized. So people are familiar with that. And let's just quickly pause on that. 80-20 is what people say. Does that mean they're spending 80% exactly in zone 1 and 20% exactly in zone 3 and nothing in zone 2?
That's what people think, but from what I understand, there's a little bit of time in zone 2, but it's specific. So it's minimal but specific. So majority of your time in zone 1 and zone 3, and then a little bit of specific time in zone 2, but very, very minimal. Like 5%, under 5%. So it's insignificant in terms of what you're spending in zone 1 and zone 3.
Yeah, and it would be hard to contemplate no cyclist avoiding tempo zone, 3 and bottom end zone 4, the sweet spot, completely. Yeah. It would be almost impossible.
It would be almost impossible. Yeah. And you can go down a rabbit hole, but it's how do you define how you're spending time in each zone? Like what are you actually looking at? But that's a whole nother video.
Yes. And then pyramidal. So that's the poorer cousin of Polarized, but no one, like, it's been spoken about, but not nearly as much. And I'm sure there are people out there watching this video that are like, sorry, what? Pyramidal? But, you know, as we'll discuss, it probably is used more in road cycling at an elite level right through to amateur than Polarized. So what is it?
Pyramidal is, if you look at the 3-zone model, so if we look at, we're building from the bottom up, if we're thinking visually, a pyramid, so down the base, we're spending majority of our time in zone 1. Then we go...
So similar to Polarized.
Similar to Polarized.
But not quite as much.
Yeah, same theory with the zone 1 model. So I would say Pyramidal and Polarized spend the same amount in zone 1. But as we progress into zone 2 and 3, it's slightly different. So Pyramidal, think about a pyramid, we got zone 1 down the bottom, and then we get a little bit smaller. We're spending a decent amount of time in zone 2, and then a little bit less time in zone 3. So the peak of the pyramid is zone 3, middle zone 2, bottom zone 1. So it's builds to a peak. So there's a lot more time in that middle zone. So tempo, sweet spot, sub threshold.
Yes, okay. And looking online, it's hard to really define the exact percentages. And I think if you go down exact percentages, it's a fair old rabbit hole. And no one's probably even, those people that are doing Polarized are really doing 100%, 80% and 100%, 20%, if that makes any sense, you know what I mean? So it's always going to be mixed, but it's more the structure and the framework. And there's been a fair bit of research, and we can link to studies below, where they've examined professional teams, and they do take more of a pyramidal approach than a polarized approach.
Yes.
And in cycling, it makes a lot of sense to be more pyramidal. Why do you think that is?
We spend a lot of time under threshold and above zone 2.
Yes.
Or zone 1, scientific model. But you spend a lot of time in that middle zone when if you think about majority of people cycling. So your normal cyclists, anywhere from 20 to 70 years old, doing Grand Fondos, long events, you're spending a lot of time in that middle zone if you're climbing or you're not necessarily riding above threshold. If you wanted to go and do, let's say, a big event in Australia, it's called Three Peaks. 235 Ks, you got 2+ hours of climbing, 2 to 3 hours of climbing in that. You're not going to go over threshold, right? So to be specific about that training, if you're thinking about your actual training model, you need to be specific about what you're doing. So spend time in zone 3, spend time in that steady state sub-threshold zone, because that's what you're going to be competing at.
Zone 3 in the 7-zone model,
zone
or the 6-zone model.
We'll so sub-threshold, sub-threshold.
So sub-threshold,
steady state,
or sweet spot.
Or sweet spot, So you're spending a lot of time in competition, and it's very specific to what most people are actually doing on the bike. And even at an elite level, racing at Tour de France, for example, you're doing mountain stages, you're spending a lot of time under your threshold, because essentially, as soon as you go over threshold, it's unsustainable, right? So anyone who's going over that, you at the end of the race, but you're spending a lot of time in that sub-threshold because it is sustainable.
Yes.
So training specific for that, if you're not training specific for that, then you're not getting the best training you can, best adaptation.
Of course, and there is a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of platforms like, I think Trainer Road, that really do preach sweet spot, that sub-threshold, because they call it the most bang for buck in your training. But also there's a different style of adaptation there, more of a top-end aerobic style adaptation, which is very well suited to cycling. Whereas if you're like a rower, you know what I mean, or maybe a middle distance runner, then the 80-20 would probably make a lot of sense, because you're not really spending a lot of time in that sweet spot area in your events.
Yeah, you're going all out.
Yes.
So most short events rowing, like you do a 5-6 minute effort, right? So it's all out. So training that all out and easy is probably the best scenario, because you're in competition, it's not specific to go and ride it or go and train in that sub-threshold sweet spot area, because we don't need it.
Yes.
Whereas cyclists, you need to be able to ride at sub-threshold. You need to be able to know what it feels like as well. So training is not necessarily all about getting the right physiological, it's about how you feel, how you can know that you can ride at tempo for 60 minutes up a big climb, knowing that you can do it, knowing that you've trained for it mentally. I can do that.
Yes.
If you've never done any of it before, and if you just focus on Polarized, for example, when you're training for a long endurance event with big climbs, what does tempo feel like? What does sub-threshold feel like? If you haven't done it, it's probably going to be quite difficult.
Yes. But so conversely, maybe there are some disciplines in road cycling where the 80-20 could work quite well, like
Yes.
crit racing, because
Exactly.
you don't do a lot of sustained stuff in crit racing. Maybe sitting on a wheel in the bunch, but if you look at a zone model in the race, it's very much I'm doing zone 1 or I'm doing zone 5, which is zone 3 in the
Yep.
3 zone model, or even zone 6.
Yeah, exactly. If you're in a breakaway in a criterium, you're probably doing VO2 max on and off, like
Yes.
you're going above threshold. When
The
you're
Noosa
on
hot dog
front.
crit.
Noosa hot dog. You're doing a neuromuscular effort out of the corner, and then you're sitting at VO2, and then you're resting, and then you're neuromuscular, and you're VO2, and then you're resting.
Yeah.
So it's that top end is really important for a 1 hour race or 45-minute race. You're not tapping into a big endurance capacity. Yes, endurance is important for it because it's an endurance event, but yeah, you don't necessarily need sweet spot sub-threshold to be good at that.
Yes, okay. So I've been on a bit of a rabbit hole with all this because the training that we did at the start of the year where you coached me was the first time that, because I was more of a polarized guy, I was like, all right, I'm either doing zone 2, this is in the RCA 7 zone model, and we'll link to a calculator below so people can use it and actually see how we do things at the RCA. But I was doing zone 2, which is zone 1 in the 3 zone model, or I'd be doing, minimum FTP and above. Mostly I'd go to the hills and start doing hill repeats. But the training we did with you was we started more on the pyramidal. So we did a lot of tempo and a lot of sweet spot stuff in the first 6 to 8 weeks. And then we transitioned in the last, I think it was 12 to 13 weeks I did in the end, to polarized. And we started to let go of some of that tempo, sweet spot, and focus more on VO2 max and aerobic stuff. And of course, maintaining the zone 2. So what was your methodology behind that approach? Because there's actually some scientific literature that supports this and says this is possibly the best approach, which we can talk about in a second, but why did you prescribe it to me in the first place?
From experience,
Okay.
mostly, and from a practical standpoint, not necessarily scientifically backed, but from a practical standpoint and what I know that I have done and what other elite athletes have done previously is you're working through the zone. So you're building that aerobic engine, top end aerobic engine before you start tapping into VO2 and aerobic work. So your body can handle it. So it's a gradual progressive overload through the zones, I would say is how I like to train people. And it's most, from my experience, obviously anecdotal and training myself as well as coaching, it's the most sustainable way to do it. So that you're teaching people to go through each zone, training that physiology. There is a specific physiology in sub-threshold sweet spot work that you want to target and you want to get good at doing, and then you get into work above threshold.
Yes. Okay.
To peak, I would say working above threshold in a short amount of time essentially is aiming to peak your performance. So you're trying to peak in that anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks that you're doing that type of work. So that was my theory when we trained with you, and most people I train with, is that we work through the zones, we get strong, like a robust aerobic engine, and then we work to try and peak that system, peak your overall fitness by doing stuff above threshold.
Yes. Well, there was a study done in, I think it was May or March last year by a few researchers telling a guy in particular, I can't recall his name off the cuff, but we'll link to the paper below, where he's taken endurance runners and they've done 16 weeks and there's 4 cohorts. One cohort's just done polarized, one's just done pyramidal, one started with polarized and then shifted to pyramidal, so 8 weeks of polarized, 8 weeks of pyramidal. And then the last cohort started exactly like we started with pyramidal and then shifted to polarized. It's across 16 weeks, and the test, I'll link to the paper below as discussed, but the testing included like a shorter test and a longer test. The group that performed the best was the group that started with pyramidal and transitioned to polarized. Now, it wasn't like huge, it was like a 0.5% or 1% increase versus the other cohorts, which were all about the same. But it was a standout. And it just goes to show that for me, anecdotally, that process that I went through with you, not only was I not fatigued during that like I typically do towards the end of a 12-week process, because I start with VO2 max and that can be very fatiguing, and I'm just going straight into the big gear hill repeats. We kind of progressively worked our way through, but I peaked, I had some really good results, and then I really maintained my fitness for much longer than I typically would when I just went to like, random style riding because family commitments and stuff got in the way. So that's why I've been down a rabbit hole going, actually, this is really good. And while we didn't label it, it actually is a label. You can label it, start with pyramidal and transition to polarized. And
Yeah.
that could work for you. It's not going to work for everyone, but it could work for a lot of people.
Yeah, although it doesn't have a label, I would say it's probably the most used training methodology, and I would call it periodization. So you're periodizing how you're training going into an event or leading into a peak. Like you're periodizing at the start, you're working on your base aerobic engine. So you're working that zone 2, 3 sub-threshold area. You're trying to get really strong, robust aerobic engine. And then the closer you get to an event, the more specific you get for that event. So that might be working at threshold, or that might be working sprints or neuromuscular anaerobic repeats because you're training for a criterium. So the closer you get to that event, you get more specific, but that robust aerobic engine is really important for everything you do in cycling because it's an endurance sport.
Absolutely.
And predominantly aerobic.
Yes. Good. Well, I'm a convert, so thank you. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right, cheers.